Gerard John Schaefer Jr., a police officer that used his badge not to protect and serve, but to hunt and kill.
How many did you get, really, Jared? They said 34. Did they get all? Or did you have private graveyards? That's it. I'm the best. I'm the best, Ted. You're gonna fry, and I'm gonna be here.
Committing some of the most brutal and grotesque murders that it's been said that he makes Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. And yet, it's likely that you have never even heard of him. Originally, I planned for this week's episode of Hot on the Case to be about multiple different serial killers that turned out to be police officers, cops, and I actually researched 2 other entire cases for that video before I started researching John Schaefer, and about 10 minutes in, I knew that this had to be its own episode. This is the horrifying life and crimes of Gerard John Schaefer Jr., also known as the Killer Cop, the Hangman, and the Butcher of Blind Creek. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's investigation. Please make sure that you're subscribed on YouTube and following wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please also make sure to like, rate, and review the show because it really, really does help me a lot. My name is Brianna, and I'm hot on the case. Gerard John Schaefer Jr. was born on March 26, 1946 in Wisconsin and was the oldest of 3 children. I will refer to him as his first name Gerard and also his middle name John throughout this episode because he went by both names. John Schaefer's dad was a traveling salesman, so the Schaefer family moved around a lot, living in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Tennessee before settling in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The relationship between the head of the Schaefer household and the rest of his family, or at least the majority of the rest of his family, was strained. John's father was said to be a cruel alcoholic since he traveled a lot for work. John's father, Gerard John Schaefer Sr., was unfaithful to his wife quite a lot while he was on the road for work. And while he was home, like I said, apparently he was a cruel alcoholic, he also neglected his eldest son, John, according to John himself. John would claim that his father only paid attention to his younger sister. John was really jealous of the relationship. He craved the attention and the relationship that his sister and dad had. This actually led to John having quite terrible self-esteem issues as a kid, and also possibly led to John becoming depressed even as a small boy. John and some of the other neighborhood boys would play make-believe games when he was a kid, things like cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians. And while they were playing these games, John always wanted to be the one that acted out being killed in these games. He would often fantasize about dying, even as a little boy. And this is only the beginning of very alarming behavior that John would exhibit just as a small child. John would sneak out at night. He would sneak into the woods to kill animals. He would also sneak into the woods to harm himself, and he would get aroused by this. And at this point, John is only 12 years old. And this isn't the only disturbing sexual behavior that John was committing at only 12 years old. John would sneak out at night to become a peeping Tom. He was sneaking around, peering into the windows or backyards of his female neighbors. He also became obsessed with women's underwear. He would steal women's underwear, and I don't know if he was sneaking into his neighbors' homes, that he was peering into their windows to steal their underwear, or if he was taking it from his mother or sister, and honestly, I don't know which one would be worse. But he would steal this underwear and he would wear these women's undergarments probably because he wanted to be a girl, because he thought if he was a girl, if he was a daughter, that he would get more attention from his dad. The family was pretty religious. John and his siblings all attended a private Catholic school. And in high school, John clearly wanted to be seen as any other normal guy. He was on the high school football team. He was a member of a couple different clubs at school. He had girlfriends. But no matter how hard he tried to mask it, people thought that he was strange. They thought that he was a creep. The girls at his school said that John would try and look up their skirts that they had to wear every single day as part of their school uniform. At 14 years old, John got into his first serious relationship, and the disturbing red flags and fantasies continued. According to John's former girlfriend, the 14-year-old John Schaefer, remember, he's still so young, used to force his girlfriend to take part in consensual, non-consensual role play. And I would just like to interject and point out that if he's forcing her to take part in this foreplay, then it's not consensual. That is just SA. By 18 years old, during his senior year of high school, John had a new girlfriend named Sandra London. Now, she's a really interesting character, and we've actually already talked about her in an earlier episode of Hot in the Case. Can you believe that? This guy's random high school girlfriend has already been mentioned in an episode of my true crime podcast. Now, if you haven't seen that episode or don't remember her, don't worry. We will go over why we've talked about her already towards the end of this episode. Now, in the beginning of their little high school relationship, Sandra said that John was a really good boyfriend, and according to her, the red flags kind of just came out of nowhere. They had been dating for a year or so when John confided in Sandra about his dark fantasies. He told her that he would spy on his female neighbors. He told her about this one lady down the street that would sunbathe in her backyard, and he would watch her. He told Sandra about the girl that lived next door. She was also a teenager. Her name was Lee Hangman, and she would always get changed in front of her window, a window where John would be able to see her getting changed. And John had convinced himself that both of these women, but specifically Lee, were doing this to put on a show for him, to tease and taunt him. And he's openly telling his girlfriend Sandra this, and he told her that it made him very angry that Lee would try to tease him in this way. John told his girlfriend Sandra that he was going to put a stop to it. He told his girlfriend that he fantasized about murdering his neighbor Lee, and that he had actually already been planning her murder. He already had all the supplies to murder her in the trunk of his car. He planned to knock Lee out with a bat, load her into the trunk of his car, take her out to the docks, load her onto his father's boat, take her out into the water, and shoot and kill her before dumping her body in the water where the alligators would hopefully do the rest. He specifically said, if there's no body, there's no crime. 5 years after this, that neighbor Lee would go missing. And remember, at this point, he's still a teenager. He's still in high school, and he's talking and fantasizing and laughing about committing a murder like it was all some sick joke. Sandra, his girlfriend, said that despite all of this, she wasn't afraid of him and thought that at the time that he was just joking around. The relationship between them would eventually end, but Sandra does come back up in this case. After graduating high school in 1964, John attended Broward Community College to study social studies, and later he switched his major to education because he had this dream of being a teacher and working with children. I'm trying to think here, I'm blanking if there's ever been a serial killer that I at least know of that has ever been a teacher. There's definitely been a lot of predators that have been teachers. Off the top of my mind, I'm thinking about the predator teacher that confessed to killing JonBenet Ramsey. But I'm trying to think if there's ever been a serial killer that has worked with children that turned out to be a serial killer. If you know any, let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in seeing a video about anything like that, let me know in the comments because I'll definitely research that. John later transferred to Florida Atlantic University in 1968 to be a part of their educational program, and it was there that he met and married his first wife. This is also where John really started to lose touch with reality. He was living in this warped sense of reality where he didn't think anything was real. And he actually planned to take his own life because he did not think that the life he was living was real life. This is also when his first marriage ended, less than 2 years after it started. His first wife said that they got a divorce because of his extreme cruelty. John says they got a divorce because his first wife didn't put out enough. As part of the educational program at FAU, John began student teaching at a few different schools. While he was student teaching at one local high school, there were so many complaints from parents and students that he was actually removed from the student teaching program at FAU after only student teaching for 1 month. But he applied and was accepted back into the student teaching program the following spring, and he started student teaching at a new high school, and again, things went terribly wrong. There were so many complaints that John was aggressive and unpredictable that high school actually wrote a letter to the educational program at FAU saying that they strongly believe that this man should never be a teacher and should never be around children or work with children in any capacity. So John was effectively removed from the educational program at FAU. So at this point, it's 1970, John is divorced, he's been kicked out of college, he's completely alone, and he's trying to figure out what his next step is. John was reading through the help wanted ads in the newspaper because that's how people got a job before LinkedIn and Indeed, and this is how John Schaefer decided that he was going to become a police officer. He went through the police academy, and I have no idea how he actually made it through the police academy because he was an oddball, to say the least. At this point, John had developed a really intense obsession with the death penalty, specifically when they used to do public hangings as a form of capital punishment. He would talk about sex a lot to the other officers in training at the police academy, but in explicit, graphic, sometimes grotesque nature. One day at the police academy, he took a Polaroid photo out of his pocket and he showed it to another guy at the academy, and this photo showed a woman who was dead. She had been brutally murdered. I don't know what this guy's reaction was, but John told him that he had gotten this photo from another police officer, and it was a crime scene photo that was taken at a crime scene. But it's much more likely that this was a photo that John had taken of one of his early victims, because it's strongly believed, if not 100% proven, that while John Schaefer was in the police academy, he was already a serial killer with at least 6 victims already. And at this point, he's only 24 years old. John Schaefer would say and do really disturbing things during his time at the academy that really creeped the other guys out. He had this pair of handcuffs, and he said that he got it from a criminal. He said that he got the handcuffs off a dead body of a criminal that had been publicly executed in Africa. John Schaefer completed his training at the academy and became a police officer for the Wilton Manor Police Department, but was fired 6 months later, after it was discovered that as a police officer, he was pulling over young, attractive women so he could get their driver's license and then get their address off their driver's license so he could show up at their homes and ask them out on a date. And this is all while he was married to his second wife, a 19-year-old girl named Teresa. And after getting fired from the Wilton Manor Police Department, John became a deputy for the Martin County Sheriff's Department after forging a letter of recommendation from Wilton Manor. And that takes us to July 21st, 1972. John was out patrolling the area when he saw 2 young girls hitchhiking, an 18-year-old Nancy Trotter and 17-year-old Paula Sue Wells. The 2 girls had only been in Florida for a couple days, they were staying with a friend at their friend's apartment, and they were just hitchhiking everywhere that they wanted to go while they were down in Florida. At the time, hitchhiking, in the 1970s in America was a lot more common, especially with the young people of the time. They just weren't as aware of the dangers and were just a lot more trusting back then. Nancy and Sue were hitchhiking this day from the beach to their friend's apartment when John, who was in uniform, he was driving his police car, pulled over to the two young girls hitchhiking and warned them that not only was hitchhiking illegal, but it was very dangerous. So as a police officer, he's a good guy, he's trusting, he offered the two young girls a ride to where they needed to go. And Nancy and Sue, who were already willing to get into a stranger's car, they took the offer because as an officer on duty, this just felt like it added an extra layer of protection and safety. And Nancy and Sue said that during this ride, John was extremely nice. He even offered to give them a safe ride to the beach the following day so they wouldn't have to hitchhike. And the next day, John picked up Nancy and Sue as planned. But this time, he was not on shift as a police officer. He was in his citizen clothes, driving his citizen car, a blue Datsun. And this might not be an instant red flag to them or to any of you guys listening, but in my head, I'm thinking if he's not working, if he's not currently on duty as a police officer, if he's not driving his police car, there's no one tracking him. There's no one that's going to be calling him, tell him he has somewhere he has to go. He has nowhere else to be. On the way to the beach, John asked the girls if they would like to make a quick stop to see a cool old Spanish fort, and the girls agree to be polite. So John turns off on the main road and he turns on to an old dirt path. And he drives down this dirt path into the middle of the woods where they come up on this little fort. Except this was not a Spanish fort. This was just an abandoned shack in the middle of the woods. But this was all John's plan. He knew where that shack was. He knew it was in the middle of nowhere, and now he has these two teenage girls all alone in the isolated wilderness. And when all three of them are now isolated in the woods, the metaphorical mask that John was wearing came off. He wasn't the nice police officer anymore that gave them a ride home. He got extremely aggressive and he told these teenage girls, Nancy and Sue, that he was going to arrest them for running away and for hitchhiking. He handcuffed them behind their backs and then he started to threaten their lives. He told them that if he wanted to, he could bury them right there and no one would ever find them. And because, if there's no body, there's no crime, he said that a lot, he would never get caught. He told them that he planned to rape and murder them. He told the two teenage girls that he would sell them into slavery. He asked the girls if they thought their parents would pay a ransom to get them back safely or not. He opens up his trunk, and in his trunk, there's like a murder supply kit in there. He's got ropes and sheets, and these two girls were frozen in fear. John gagged Sue and he starts tying her up. He ties her legs together. He loops the rope around her shoulders so she can barely move. And then he starts leading Sue away in the woods, leaving Nancy behind. And he tells Nancy that she better not try and run away because if she tries to run away, he will kill her friend. And then afterwards, he will catch up and kill her too. And he will catch up to her because he's a police officer and she's just a little girl and she can't outrun him. So Nancy doesn't run away. And when John returns, her friend Sue is not with him. Nancy is still handcuffed and now she's gagged. John brings her to the edge of the Indian River in the middle of the woods. He ties her legs up as well, and he forces her to stand on this big above ground root of a tree. And then he has her on this root, and then he puts a noose around her neck. At this point, with the noose around her neck and she's standing on this above ground tree root, if she makes any sudden movements, If she loses balance, she will hang herself. John then touched Nancy on the butt and told her if he wanted to, he could rape her right there. He then told her not to try and run away, and then he turned around and he walked away. And I'm like 99.999% sure that John was planning on coming back to murder Nancy, that he had terrible, brutal plans for her, a bunch of horrible, horrific things that he was planning on doing to her. But luckily, thankfully, he never got the chance because Nancy did run away and she did escape. The moment that John was out of her sight, she began biting at the rope, trying to wiggle her way out of the knots. And remember, she's got a noose around her neck. If she makes one wrong move and she falls off this root that she's standing on, if she loses her balance, she will instantly hang herself. But Nancy did get out of the rope and she immediately jumps into the river that is next to her and she's running through the water. And I don't know how long she was doing this before she starts hearing someone calling out her name. They're calling out her name softly. It's like, Nancy, Nancy, where are you? It was Nancy's friend Sue calling out her name. Sue was still alive. And Nancy's looking around for her friend, but she doesn't see her. She just hears her. And Nancy is terrified that this is a trap, that John is trying to trick Nancy into showing where she's at. So Nancy decides to leave her friend Sue behind because she's thinking, or at least hoping, that this is their best chance of them both surviving. That if she finds help, that they both have a better chance. At one point, the water in the river was so deep that Nancy was swimming while she's still handcuffed. And at one point, she swims right through a bunch of jellyfish and she gets stung twice. This has to be up there with one of the most unimaginable, craziest survival stories that I've ever heard of. And eventually Nancy sees a road and she drags herself out of the river and she starts screaming for help. And then a car pulls up. It's a Martin County Sheriff's Department car. The same sheriff's department that John worked for. It was probably like the exact same car that her and Sue had gone a ride from, the day prior. And I couldn't even imagine it, the fear. I'm sure Nancy's thinking, he's found me. This is John and he's found me. But it wasn't John that got out of that car. It was Sheriff Robert Crowder. And I'm sure the second that she sees that it's a man that's not John, there was a sigh of relief. This man was going to save her. And then the sheriff says to her, "I've been looking for you, Nancy." Turns out Sue had already gotten herself free and had found a road and had found help before Nancy did. Sue was brought to the sheriff's station where the terrified Sue had already told Sheriff Robert Crowder that a police officer had kidnapped her and her friend and was trying to kill them, and that her friend Nancy was still out there. So Crowder was out searching for Nancy when he stumbled upon her, climbing out of the river, and she is so lucky that he was the one that found her. Now, back to John Schaefer. So he thought that he had complete control over these teenage girls, and when he realized that he had lost both of them, that they both escaped, he realized that he was screwed and that he needed to do some serious damage control. So coincidentally, John actually had already called Sheriff Crowder before Crowder found Sue or Nancy to tell his boss that he really messed up, that he made a foolish mistake, and that Crowder was going to be very mad at him. John told his boss, Sheriff Crowder, that he had picked up 2 girls that were hitchhiking and he wanted to teach them a lesson about the dangers of getting in a stranger's car. He tied them up in the woods and he left them there, but he was planning on coming back and letting them go. He just wanted to scare them a little bit so that they would never hitchhike again. Sheriff Crowder really did try the do the right thing. He did not believe John at all, and John was arrested on 2 counts of false imprisonment and 2 counts of aggravated assault. But he was granted bail and was allowed to go back into society. He was released pending his trial. And this would end up being one of many terrible mistakes that had deadly consequences. Only a few months later, while out on bail, John Schaefer abducted 2 more teenage girls, and this time he killed them. 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup met and became friends during a program to get their GEDs. 16-year-old Georgia Jessup was hanging out with this older guy at the time named Jerry Shepard. And on September 27th, 1972, Georgia, Jerry, and Susan made plans to go to the beach together. Georgia and Jerry went to go pick up Susan at her parents' home, and her mother got instant bad vibes from this older guy hanging out with these 2 younger girls. She did not like this Jerry guy. And this was definitely mother's intuition, because she was so creeped out by this guy Jerry that she secretly wrote down what car he was driving as well as the license plate number. And then she watched as her 17-year-old daughter and her daughter's 16-year-old friend drove off in this guy's blue Datsun. And that was the last time either girl was ever seen alive. And if it's not already painfully obvious to everyone listening, watching this episode, Jerry Shepard was a fake name, and this was John Schaefer. He took Susan and Georgia to the same woods that he kidnapped Sue and Nancy, and he brutally murdered Susan and Georgia. And then 3 months later, he went back to court on trial for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Sue and Nancy. He took a plea deal while still maintaining his innocence. He just kept claiming that the entire thing was a huge misunderstanding and he really was just trying to teach these girls a lesson, and things went too far. So with the plea deal, he was convicted on 1 count of aggravated assault. And on December 22nd, 1972, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison with the chance of early release after 6 months. But the court made a terrible mistake, since at the point where he was sentenced, it was only 3 days until Christmas. Instead of immediately sending him to prison like they do with every other criminal after sentencing, the court let him go home and celebrate the holidays with his family, and only asked that he return to serve out his sentence on January 15th, 1973. And I have no clue how they came up with this date, because it's a whole 2 weeks after the New Year's. But this mistake would also have deadly consequences. By March of 1973, John had already spent the holidays with his family and had returned to serve out his 1-year prison sentence. But the 2 girls that he murdered while out on bail pending his trial, Susan and Georgia, had not been found yet, and they were still missing persons. They vanished in September of 1972, and it wasn't until March of 1973 that the license plate number that Susan's mother had wrote down was discovered to be registered to John Schaefer, and his photo was picked out of a photo lineup by Susan's mother. The man that has now been connected to the disappearances of 2 teenage girls was currently sitting in prison for the kidnapping and attempted murder of 2 teenage girls. They questioned John while he was sitting in prison, but he denied ever even meeting Georgia or Susan. And you know what they say, no body, no crime, so nothing was done until April 1st, 1973, when the badly decomposed bodies of Susan and Georgia were found in the woods only a few miles away from where Sue and Nancy were attacked by John Schaefer. The condition in which Susan and Georgia's bodies were discovered in was nothing short of horrifying. The word butchered has been used to describe it. They were bound, mutilated, decapitated. Their body parts were scattered throughout the woods. One of their torsos was bound to a tree. There was evidence of extreme torture, and that these 2 teenage girls had suffered slow, painful deaths. It is believed that at the very least, a knife, an axe, and a gun were used in their murders, and that one or more likely both of their bodies had been hung from a tree that was near their bodies. With John Schaefer already sitting in prison and already linked to the disappearances of the 2 young girls that have now been found murdered, a search warrant was issued for his home, his car, and his mother's home because John Schaefer would use a spare bedroom at his mom's house for storage. And what was found in that bedroom not only linked John Schaefer to the murders of Susan and Georgia, but also to the murders of several other young girls. In that room, there were books on torture, there were several weapons, like 12 knives, and there were guns. There were hundreds of pages that John had written or drew on that depicted young girls being tortured, killed, and mutilated. I believe the exact number is close or over 300 pages where John wrote or drew young women being raped, tortured, murdered, and hanging. He wrote that he would force his victims to drink large quantities of alcohol before they were hung so that they would urinate and or defecate themselves because he would get off on seeing that. He wrote that he would return to the crime scenes sometimes weeks or even months later to commit necrophilia. 37 Polaroid photos were found of murdered women. Some were mutilated or hanging. And this brings us back to when John was in the police academy and he showed another officer a photo of a murdered woman. It's extremely likely that this was a photo of one of his victims that he had killed, and then he showed it to an officer at the police academy. There were also boxes of women's belongings, IDs, jewelry, clothing, shoes. There were also teeth found that belonged to at least 8 victims. A pair of Susan Place's shoes were found amongst his belongings, and John's second wife had the purse that belonged to Georgia Jessup, and she said that her husband gave it to her as a gift. On May 18th, 1972, he was charged with the murders of Susan and Georgia, and he was also given a psychiatric evaluation where he was discovered to be an extremely dangerous individual with extreme sexual perversions and paranoid psychosis. But he was deemed competent to stand trial, and in October of 1973, he was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Susan and Georgia, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And if you're at all wondering about his second wife, Teresa, what happened to her, I have a little bit of information. So when John was arrested the first time for the aggravated assault and false imprisonment of Sue and Nancy, she stuck by him and she really did believe his story that he was just trying to scare them straight, and it just, backfired on him. But obviously when he was arrested for the murders of teenage girls and they found all that stuff in her possession, like she even had a victim's purse in her possession, she divorced him and then actually married her ex-husband John's lawyer, the lawyer that John Schaefer had when he was on trial for murdering Susan and Georgia. Yeah, she married him in December of 1973, 2 months after John Schaefer was found guilty for murder and sent to prison. Although John Schaefer Jr. has been linked to at least 28 murders of young women and girls, with physical evidence found for at least 11 of those murders, he has only been convicted of 2 of those murders, the murders of Susan and Georgia, meaning in the eyes of the law, John isn't even technically considered a serial killer. Although we know that's bullshit. These are some of the other missing and murdered women and girls that are strongly believed to be victims of John. On October 22nd, 1966, 21-year-old Nancy Lechner and 20-year-old Pamela Nader had plans to go hiking and were never seen again. On September 8th, 1969, the 24-year-old former neighbor of John's, Lee Heinlein Bonadies, vanished. This was the same old neighbor that John used to tell his ex-girlfriend would tease him and he planned to kill one day. She vanished only 2 weeks after she got married. She told her husband that she had plans to meet an old friend who offered her a job, and then she was never seen again. John was actually questioned by a PI following her disappearance. A necklace engraved with the name Lee that was spelled the way that Lee Heinlein spelled her name, which is Leigh, was found in John's things, and her body was tragically discovered in April of 1978, almost 10 years after she disappeared. December 18th, 1969, 22-year-old Carmen Hollick vanished after telling her friends that she was meeting with a teacher from Broward Community College who wanted to try and help her get a job. Carmen's sister said that this teacher was a male teacher, and this would have been the exact same time that John was attending Broward Community College. Carmen was never found, not even to this day, but 2 of her teeth were found in John's home. December 29th, 1969, 9-year-old Peggy Rand and 8-year-old Wendy Stevenson were last seen at the beach buying ice cream, and they were last seen with a man that sort of fit John's description. His MO is to abduct 2 women at the same time that are friends, but Peggy and Wendy are much younger than his other presumed victims. However, he later confessed to both of their murders to his ex-girlfriend, Sandra London. All of these victims so far, up to this point, were before Gerard even became a police officer. So everything after this point is after he's already been a police officer. January 4th, 1972, 22-year-old Belinda Hutchins was last seen getting into a blue Datsun. Her address book was discovered in John's belongings, and in the book was the name Jerry Shepard, which was John's fake name that he would use. February 29th, 1972, 13-year-old Deborah Lowe vanished walking to school. Reportedly, John actually worked with Deborah's father, and her family believes that John was responsible for her murder. She has never been found. On October 26, 1972, 14-year-old Mary Alice Brascolina and 13-year-old Elsie Farmer vanished while hitchhiking. Their decapitated bodies were discovered in a construction site in 1973. 2 belongings that belonged to Mary Alice were discovered in John Schaefer's things, and at the time of both of their disappearances, Mary Alice's older sister was dating a man named Jerry Shepard. Again, this was John Schaefer's fake name that he would give out. Their murders would have never happened if John wasn't let out on bail. And the next 3 murders I'm going to tell you about happened while John was supposed to be locked up. They happened while he was allowed to return home for the holidays. The day following his sentencing, so the day after he was released to go spend the holidays with family, on December 23rd, 1972, 15-year-old Susan Poole vanished. This was only 2 days before Christmas. Her body wasn't discovered for 2 years. Her remains were found tied to a tree, and they were sadly not even identified until very recently in 2022. On January 11th, 1973, 4 days before John was set to return to prison to serve out his 1-year sentence, 2 19-year-old girls named Colette Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox disappeared. Both of their IDs were found in John Schaefer's belongings, and their remains weren't discovered until 1977. There are other belongings that clearly belonged to young women, young girls, that have never been linked to any missing or murdered girls, and this included a charm in the shape of a heart with the initials MTN on it. The true numbers of victims is not known and will likely never be known. While in Florida State Prison, John met and became very good friends with another infamous serial killer, Ted Bundy. The other inmates at that prison said that John Schaefer Jr. made Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. John also later claims that Ted Bundy actually took inspiration from him and was essentially a copycat killer. If you're familiar with Ted Bundy's crimes at all, before the murders he committed in Florida, his MO was to kidnap and murder young women, except on one day in 1974, where he abducted and killed 2 women on the same day. He claims that Ted Bundy told him that he was inspired by his crimes to do this, that Ted abducted these women, brought them into the woods where he strangled them instead of hanging them, and then he cut off their heads and returned to have sex with their corpses.
He told me that he had followed my case in the detective magazines, and that he had killed 2 girls in Washington as a copycat crime, so to speak, on the place in Jessup. And I think those were Ott and Naisland. And he would tell me that he took them up on the logging road and strangled them and had with their corpses, and went back and had with their corpses and cut off their heads. Like, it's a tribute. And I'm thinking, you motherfuckers that wrote that. I said, here's the guy who read it, believed your bullshit, and went out and did something like this. And now he's like bragging to me. It wasn't exactly a brag, it was like a tribute. How many did you get, really, Jerry? They said 34. Did they get all of them? Or did you have private graveyards? I said, Dad, I'm the best. What can I say to somebody like that, right? What can you say? You're left without any kind of rational response, because if you say, Ted, it's all bullshit, he's going to say, no, it's not. I know. And he knew, see, because he had lived it. And I hadn't lived it, except through what was written about me. And he was doing it based on what he had read. So he had 36. He wanted to be the best. And he was obsessed because they said I had 34. And he was afraid that I had ones that he didn't know about, see? And he was always trying to get me to say, no, that's all I got, 34, you know? But I never would say that. I discerned that he was concerned about the number. And it was my own way of needling him back by saying, I'm the best, Ted. You're going to fry, and I'm going to be here, and I'll be the best, just like they said. The number 1. Mr. Stone had it all right. The best there ever was. And you're nothing. And he'd just go crazy. Can't be. And I'd take out my little thing from the Palm Beach Post. I said, read that, man. Cult. First page. Palm Beach Post.
While in prison, John reconnected with his old high school girlfriend, Sandra London. He would write her letters, sometimes confess to different murders over the years. He would tell her that he liked killing 2 at a time, and he called this doing doubles. He said that he would often make the 2 friends pick who he murdered first, and he would relish in watching these 2 friends argue and try to convince him that their friend deserved to die more than them. Sandra London was actually the one to reach out to her former high school boyfriend after he was arrested for murdering teenage girls, because Sandra London wanted to help him publish those writings and illustrations I told you about. And together they published 2 books, Killer Fiction and Beyond Killer Fiction.
The only writing that most cops do is paperwork and parking tickets. But Deputy Sheriff Gerard Schaefer wrote much more than that. He penned a macabre manuscript that hid his darkest secrets.
The handcuffs were locked around her wrists and the blindfold placed over her eyes. She was then led away into the dark to the place of execution. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. Her terror must have blocked off the pain.
John Schaefer Jr. would claim that these were works of fiction, but the more likely scenario is actually that these were the confessions of all the murders that he had ever committed. John and Sandra rekindled their relationship and dated for a while before it ended, and then Sandra went on to start a relationship with another infamous serial killer from Florida, the Gainesville Ripper Danny Rolling, who also murdered, raped, and mutilated young women. You gotta type there, Sandra. And if the Gainesville Ripper of Danny Rolling at all sounds familiar to you, it's because we actually covered Danny Rolling in an earlier episode of Hot on the Case. Sandra and Danny were actually engaged. He sang to her during his trial. I'm sure you guys remember that clip if you watched that episode. And she also wrote books about Danny Rolling, and they were engaged all the way up until he was executed. John did not like being called a serial killer in the media. He would claim his innocence and then he would confess. He would actually spend 20 years confessing to murders and then recanting those confessions before he was stabbed to death in his cell by another inmate in 1995. Some might call that justice, but the reality is, because he was murdered, we will never know the full scale of his crimes. Investigators believe that he could have killed dozens, dozens more victims than were ever proven. And now those stories are lost forever. John Schaefer Jr. hid behind a badge. He used his authority as a weapon and committed murders that were so cruel that even other killers called him a monster. He wrote about his murders in chilling, taunting detail, and in the end, the most terrifying thing about Gerard John Schaefer wasn't just what he did to his victims, but how easy it was for him to do it. And in the end, I think that's what scares me the most, because how many other predators are out there hiding in plain sight? People that we've been told since we were children that we should be able to trust. And that's all I have for this week's episode of Hot on the Case. Thank you so much if you made it to the end of this week's episode, because I know it was a long one. And I will see you guys all next week when we are hot on the case once again.